are you doing, Carlos?
Good. How you doing, John?
I'm doing well. So I hear that you were originally in the House of Representatives, and now you're running for the Senate. Can you tell me a little bit about why you decided to switch chambers?
That's right. Well, thank you for welcoming me onto the program. So, yeah, I served for 6 years in the Florida House of Representatives. I was elected in 2016, served 3 2-year terms until 2022. And now I'm running for Florida Senate District 17. That is a district located in East Orange County. And many of my priorities as a senator would be similar to what they were as a member of the House of Representatives. For years, we put forward legislation to make Florida affordable again. We have a soaring property insurance rate crisis where we're seeing property insurance rates are 5 times the national average in the state of Florida. We're going to be prioritizing raising teacher pay. Right now, unfortunately, Florida is 50th in the nation as it relates to average teacher pay, which is just embarrassing. We have to do better by our teachers, and that is something that is really driving the teacher shortage crisis that we are dealing with here in the state of Florida. We've also prioritized reducing gun violence and protecting our communities from gun violence. I was elected in 2016, just months after the tragedy at Pulse nightclub. I've seen how gun violence can really devastate communities. And that's why we've, introduced legislation, particularly around restricting access to military style assault weapons. The list goes on and on about the different issues that we have tackled, whether it be housing affordability, the cost of living, reproductive rights, the rights of women, LGBTQ people, immigrants, workers. There's so many issues to be dealt with in Tallahassee, a lot of crises that we need to solve. I'm a problem solver, and that's why I'm running for state senate, so that folks in Central Florida can have a champion that really cares about people, who prioritizes people over corporations, and who's going to focus on actually solving problems rather than creating them.
Do you feel like your role will be changed significantly by being in the Senate as opposed to the House?
Well, sure. We would have a much bigger role over in the Florida Senate. For those who don't know, the Florida House of Representatives has 120 members representing different areas of the state of Florida. The Florida Senate has only 40 senators. So with that being said, there's a lot more responsibility. We make a lot more of an impact, and certainly we would have a lot more influence on how the state budget would be crafted. While I was a member of the Florida House, many of the successes that I found as a lawmaker were in securing dollars and resources for our community in the state budget. For example, we secured millions of dollars to help veterans and survivors of mass shootings who are dealing with PTSD. We were able to secure actually tens of millions of dollars to help people with disabilities get onto the iBudget waiver program so that they can receive the services that they need to live and work in their communities and live happy, healthy, and productive lives. And we've also been able to secure funding for arts programs. In fact, my last year in the Florida House of Representatives was the first year that we were able to fully fund our arts and culture programs, which really have a $4 billion economic impact in our state, especially in Orlando and Central Florida. I plan on certainly prioritizing many of those issues again and trying to secure really important resources that are needed for our constituents in Orlando and Central Florida, and using my role as a state senator to help craft the budget based on the needs of our constituents.
You had mentioned how there's a lot fewer members in the Senate than there is in the House. Do you feel like that puts more distance between you and your constituents?
Not at all. As a member of the Florida House and as a future member of the Florida Senate, we have always prided ourselves in being open and accessible to our constituents. That includes not only our presence in the community and making sure that we're always represented and there's a face of our office out in our neighborhoods and in community events, but also on social media, on email, being responsive and being engaged with our community is really, really important. And I don't see that level of accessibility to me changing as a member of the Florida Senate compared to the state house.
That's fantastic news. So I heard that you had recently endorsed the Digital Democracy Project.
That's right.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you understand what we're doing and how you think it might help with your role in the Senate?
Absolutely. I really applaud what digital democracy is doing because oftentimes we know that voters have a lot on their plates. They have very, very busy lives. It's very hard for them to keep up with what's happening in politics, what's happening in government. And most of the time, they are more aware about what's happening in Congress and in DC than they know about what's happening in their own state legislature. So what you're doing through digital democracy about showing voters and constituents information on how their state representatives and senators are voting on the issues that they care about in clear, concise ways so that they can really understand exactly what issues are being debated and where their elected representatives and senators stand, I think is really doing a service to our constituency and to our democracy, because it is really hard for people to find ways to get engaged, but digital democracy is really providing the tools and the platform that they can do so quickly and easily.
I do have to admit, I'm one of those people that probably focuses a little bit more on federal policy than I do on state level policy. So I think that, it does offer a really good way to access what's actually happening immediately around you and being able to affect the laws that are being passed. So Sadie was telling me that one of your big priorities was helping people with disabilities. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you've done and some of the work that you plan on doing?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really, really unfortunate and sad, frankly, is that in the state of Florida, 22,000 Floridians living with disabilities have been lingering on years-long waiting lists to receive services that help them live and work in their communities so that they can live happy, healthy, and productive lives. Many of the 22,000 individuals on the waiting list, actually 40% of those individuals, have been waiting for services for more than 10 years. Some will actually die while on the waiting list without ever receiving services. That has everything to do with how this state and our government has not prioritized the needs of our most vulnerable communities, and that includes people living with disabilities. While I was a member of the state house, we really tried to shine a spotlight on this very real problem, this problem that so many individuals are waiting for services that they qualify for, but that the state has not appropriated resources to fund. And so, particularly in my last year in the House, which was 2022, we were able to secure $59 million to help reduce the 22,000 person waiting list, but we weren't able to reduce it enough. And that's because we know that this issue really needs to be prioritized by our state government. We know that we need to get all individuals at the table, both Republican and Democrat, to figure out a way to not just reduce the waiting list, but actually eliminate the waiting list over time so that these individuals can have the services that they frankly deserve. And those are services through the iBudget Medicaid waiver program that the state of Florida is authorized to be able to run under Medicaid. This is something that's been a huge priority, but unfortunately, our state has neglected for too long. And we know that that's going to be a big priority for us in the Florida Senate.
I see. So you had sort of mentioned it there at the end. And, I want to kind of touch on the idea. So some people might assume that this is nefarious and intentional, and some people might assume that it's from neglect. Do you have any opinions on how this backlog got so bad and why it continues to be so bad?
I do. The reality is that the Florida legislature passes a budget every single year. It includes good things, it includes not so good things, but the budget every year is a values document that really reflects the values and priorities of the state of Florida. And the fact that this list has been allowed to linger and grow for so long for so many people who are in need, unfortunately, is a reflection of the values of the Florida legislature, which is why we have to change. We have a governor right now who is out there bragging about the fact that the state has a $14 billion budget surplus. That's billion with a B. Well, we know that so many people can be helped if we were able to use those resources and budget reserves to be able to provide the critical government services that they deserve, particularly in this case, those individuals that have been lingering on years-long waiting lists. But it's not only funding. We know that there's other solutions to this problem. For example, I have introduced legislation in the past that I plan on reintroducing again in the Florida Senate, which is a program that we like to call a Medicaid buy-in program. Basically, that would allow for many individuals on the iBudget waiver waiting list, people with disabilities, to be able to pay a modest and affordable premium to cost share with the state to actually be able to enroll in those services that they have been waiting for and also have skin in the game. So it's cost sharing. The individual pays a modest premium. The state pays a share of it as well. And many people may be wondering, well, okay, what's the difference between that and just getting private health insurance? There's a big difference. Many people who are on the iBudget waiting list, who are people living with disabilities, need something called personal supports or personal support services. That is someone that helps them with daily life activities, helps them get up in the morning and get dressed, depending on what type of disability they have, helps them go to the grocery store, get groceries and daily supplies and needs that they have that they're not able to go get themselves. Sometimes it even includes that personal support bringing them to work so that they can earn an income and earn a living. Personal supports are never covered under private insurance. It's always out of pocket. And most people, especially those living with disabilities who have a more limited income, are not able to spend, let's say, $30,000, $35,000 a year out of pocket to be able to provide those personal supports that they need to live their daily lives. It's why it's so important that we do everything that we can to make sure that those individuals are taken care of, that they get the services that they deserve, but also that we put all policy solutions on the table. Because if those in government from all political persuasions and perspectives really believe that every individual should be able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps and be self-sufficient, we also need to understand that individuals are sometimes limited with some of these programs and what they are and are not able to do. So that's just one idea, one proposal that we've put forward in the past that we plan on pursuing again in the Florida Senate.
Well, I hope you're successful. They certainly do need help. As far as the funding that comes for the people with disabilities, is that something that comes out of the federal budget that they can't access, or is this a state level funded program?
The Medicaid iBudget waiver program usually comes out of general revenue. So this is something that would come out of the state's overall budget. But I think it's really important for Floridians to understand, while Florida is required to have a balanced budget, as all state governments are constitutionally required to do, 1 out of every $3 in Florida's state budget comes from the federal government. That's federal money. For example, in this past budget year, we saw upwards of $35 billion in federal money that was part of our state budget. And so I think it's important for folks to contextualize that when they hear politicians say things like the federal government needs to tighten its belt and they need to do what we've done here in Florida to balance our budget. Yes, they do need to work on a budget, and yes, they do need to tighten their belt, but we also need to understand the full context, which is that the state of Florida cannot balance a budget without the support of the federal government. And also remembering that 1 out of every $3 in the state budget is actually federal dollars.
I think that's a really good point. You know, if the federal government did what people are advocating for them to do, which is tighten their belt, that may end up with Florida not having that $14 billion budget surplus.
Pretty much. Or Florida not having our roads funded or our schools funded or other important infrastructure and critical services that we rely upon our state budget for.
Absolutely. So I was talking to a representative the other day, and they were telling me a little bit about that the state government was preempting local governments by not allowing them to pass worker protection laws in their local districts, and that they had to kind of defer to state level protections. Can you tell me a little bit about your opinion on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. Unfortunately, the Florida legislature this year passed a law that preempted local governments, basically took away their local power to be able to enact important protections for workers that are working outdoors, protections from heat stress. We have a lot of workers in Florida that spend many, many hours out in extreme temperatures here. We are the Sunshine State. There's a lot of fundamental protections that are needed for our outdoor workers. Many of them include access to shade, access to cool drinking water, and breaks if they have been spending many hours in the outdoors in extreme temperatures. Unfortunately, this preemption law that was enacted by Governor DeSantis this year and passed by the Florida legislature prohibits and bans local cities and counties from being able to enact those types of requirements for employers of outdoor workers. And so, as a result of that, we default back to the statewide law that doesn't really offer many of these critical protections that protect the health and safety of these outdoor workers, which is really unfortunate because when you pull the curtain back and understand exactly why this preemption law, this ban on local protections for outdoor workers was really passed, you understand that large corporations, big employers who made giant campaign contributions to many lawmakers in the Florida legislature, they are the ones who wanted to see these laws passed. They didn't want to see local cities and counties requiring them to guarantee shade, breaks if they were exposed to extreme temperatures for many hours of the day, or even access to cool drinking water while they were working outside. That was something that affected their bottom line. And so they lobbied in order to have this law passed. And unfortunately, the majority passed it out and the governor signed it. And this is really bad for our workers.
Do you think being a senator might give you a little bit more sway over being able to affect this issue? Or do you think that this is something that the House would have to address?
Well, this is certainly something that both chambers needs to be involved on. As a member of the Florida Senate, I plan on reintroducing legislation that I did introduce in the House that actually brings us in the opposite direction. If the argument from the legislature is, which it currently has been, that they don't want local cities and counties enacting local regulations and protections for outdoor workers, then the state needs to step in, and the state needs to basically establish that floor of protection statewide that is a minimum guarantee no matter what city or county you live in the state of Florida, to make sure that these outdoor workers are protected. That is legislation that I introduced that would have a statewide impact for our workers, that they would have access to shade, they would have access to water, and they would be able to protect themselves from extreme heat as outdoor workers. And it's something that I plan on reintroducing in the Florida Senate as well.
That's fantastic. You know, it feels like this should be almost common sense legislation. I mean, these are the people producing value. These are people doing the work. It seems like they should have the most protection. I mean, they bring value to the economy. They make sure that, you know, all of our farm work gets done and the people stay fed.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And I'll just add to that, John, that unfortunately, it says a lot about the legislature that corporations and big businesses have so much sway and so much power over what types of laws are passed out of the legislature and signed by the governor, laws that are really ones that are being pushed by big corporations rather than by our individual constituents. We just talked about the preemption law as an example, but we also saw that the Florida legislature this year passed legislation that weakens and waters down child labor protections as well at the behest of large corporations. In past legislative sessions, they've also passed out new laws that would have taken away incentives for homeowners to be able to benefit from net metering discounts for solar that they have on their roofs. That was legislation that was written by FPL and given to lawmakers to introduce because this was something that would have protected their bottom line and allowed for them to take away those net metering discounts and benefits from homeowners that had rooftop solar on their homes. This is just a few examples of how corporations have way too much influence. It's why we have not relied on corporate contributions to fund our campaign for state senate. We've relied on people, the grassroots, to help fund our campaign, because that's really the best way to make sure that our lawmakers are kept honest and accountable to the people that they represent rather than to corporations.
We completely agree. I mean, I think one of our big drives is that we want people to understand the issues that are affecting them on a day-to-day basis, but we're really focused on having them get involved with their representatives, tell people what they want, make sure they understand the laws that are being passed, and maybe have some semblance of power where they could remove laws that are hurting them and pass laws that would make their lives better. And I think that just by having more voices in the room, it may diminish some of that corporate power that seems to be affecting so much in the legislature. There's another issue that I wanted to ask you. I had heard that they had redrawn some districts in your last race, and that may have affected the outcomes. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I ran for re-election in 2022. That was the same year as redistricting. That's the process where the Florida legislature redraws our state and Senate maps and the boundaries in to be reflected with the census that happened the previous year and our population changes. And unfortunately, my district, my House district, was sliced up into little bits. It was pushed into Seminole County to the north of the district that I used to represent. And unfortunately, I lost my reelection by 4 percentage points. I know that also has a lot to do with voter turnout or lack thereof. For example, this was a district that voted 9 percentage points for President Biden in the previous election, which means that if voters, our Democratic voters, would have turned out and participated in the election, that there may have been a different outcome. Unfortunately, even with that plus 9% advantage, we had Republican voters actually turned out at a 14% higher rate than Democratic voters in that district. You can do the math right there, and you can see that, unfortunately, due to that lack of turnout, we didn't get the result that we wanted. But now I'm running for Florida Senate. I am running for a district entirely within Orange County, which includes all of my Orange County House district before it was redrawn, plus parts of downtown Orlando, Lake Nona, Belle Isle, Laureate Park, and the Conway area. And it would be my honor to serve those constituents as a member of the Florida Senate.
Do you feel like coming from the House that gives you an advantage in the Senate?
Sure. Well, we have joined forces with other candidates like Anna Viescamani, who's running for re-election for State House, Stephanie Vanos, who's actually running for Orange County School Board, Nate Douglas, who's running for House District 37, and Representative Tom Keene, who's running in 35. These are all areas that overlap with the Senate district where I'm running in. And what we have found is that we are aligned on so many of the issues. We are values aligned with these candidates and with these campaigns. We know resources for each campaign is limited. Those resources are limited. And so we've decided to join forces and pool our volunteers, if you will, when we knock on doors and when we have volunteer events, when we are reaching out and engaging our voters directly door to door, because we know that that can help lift all boats. It can help drive voter turnout overall. And it will not only help me get elected to the state Senate, but also be able to help many of these campaigns and candidates as well through higher voter turnout.
What are some really important issues that you think Florida voters are dealing with that haven't gone addressed yet in the interview?
Unfortunately, what we have is a affordability crisis in the state of Florida. Our state has taken its eye off the ball. It has not focused on doing things like reducing property insurance rates, which currently are 5 times the national average in Florida. Right now, Florida is number 1 for average car insurance rates in the country as well. Instead, this governor and this legislature have prioritized culture wars, regulating pronouns, banning abortions at 6 weeks. All of these ideas are bad proposals that harm Floridians, but they've also meant that we have not addressed many of the crises that are happening in our state. When it comes to housing affordability, I think that it's really, really important that we take a comprehensive approach to being able to tackle soaring rents, out of control property insurance as well. First on housing availability and housing affordability. Right here in Orange County, we have this thing called TDT, that's Tourist Development Tax, also known as the bed tax. Well, unfortunately, state law regulates how TDT taxes are allowed to be spent. Currently, 40% of the local tourist development tax budget, which is paid by tourists who spend a night in a hotel, 40% of those funds must be spent on tourism advertising before they are eligible to be spent on other things like workforce housing. I think that that's wrong. But what we have is we have a battle between the tourism executives, whether it be the theme parks, the hotels, the restaurant executives, who want the tourist development tax spent on their priorities, on tourism advertising, and not on the needs of the community, frankly. It has led to inaction by politicians on both sides of the aisle. That's why I am going to prioritize introducing legislation that diversifies how we are able to spend TDT tax dollars. It means that we would be able to free up some of those local TDT funds still to be spent on tourism related needs, but we have to understand that tourism related needs includes workforce housing. It includes transportation infrastructure, because we want tourism. Tourism is at the center and it is the driver of our local economy. But what comes with increases in tourism are more community needs, more stress on our roads, more stress on our infrastructure, more housing needs and affordable and attainable housing units. So I think diversifying the way that we spend TDT to allow more spending on those needs like workforce housing and transportation infrastructure is critical to being able to solve some of these problems. And we can do it without raising a single penny in taxes. It's just about diversifying how those taxes are legally allowed to be spent. Now, when it comes to property insurance is a very difficult and complex problem to solve. But what we have to do is we've got to take care of the basics. We've got to make sure that our property insurance companies are regulated, that they are accountable to consumers when they need payments on their claims. And we have to make sure that we're doing something, taking action to actually put money back in the pockets of our policyholders rather than just protecting the profits of property insurance companies. One idea that I'm really excited about and have been continuing to talk about when I've been engaging with voters at the doors is something called universal wind coverage. Universal wind coverage is something that's currently provided in the state of Texas, where homeowners pay a modest premium to a state-backed insurance provider that then provides them with wind coverage so that they don't have to get wind coverage through their private property insurer. Right now, two of the main drivers of our property insurance premiums in Florida are flood and wind. Being able to have citizens insurance, which is currently known as the insurer of last resort, not be the insurer of last resort anymore, but instead be a state-backed insurance program that allows for anyone who needs wind coverage to pay a modest premium in order to provide it, is something that can drive down overall insurance premiums in the state of Florida for policyholders. I know a lot of folks are probably listening to this wondering, is this something that we can actually do? Having our state government back universal wind coverage sounds like a bit of a risk. It may be, but at the end of the day, the property insurance crisis is serious. It is getting worse and worse, and we have to put all solutions on the table, including bold solutions. This one, which is a bipartisan solution that has been introduced by Republican lawmakers in the past in order to try to tackle this problem.
You made so many good points there. So I think one thing I want to comment on is the TDT. You know, it's interesting that it's actually legislated that 40% of the TDT tax has to be spent on advertising for more tourism. It occurs to me that, you know, the infrastructure that you build matches the size of the community that it's in. And then when you have a lot of tourists come in, they're using a lot of that infrastructure. So it would wear out at a rate faster than what the local populace would use it. So it seems like the TDT should on its face pay for repairing infrastructure or expanding infrastructure in order to support the tourists that come in, as opposed to just continuing to get a larger and larger percentage of tourists coming in. Because if you're not addressing the infrastructure problem, then having twice as many tourists next year than you did this year seems to actually exacerbate the problem.
That's right. And at the end of the day, here's what we see tourist development taxes are being spent on, at least locally here in Orange County. It's being spent to expand half-empty convention centers that offer low-wage jobs. It's being spent to build new roofs on entertainment venues and giant concert halls. And it's being spent, unfortunately, to engage in corporate welfare, to pay for tourism advertising for giant worldwide conglomerates who have their own advertising budget already. Mm-hmm. I think that TDT dollars need to be spent on the needs of the community as they relate to the stress on our infrastructure and the local needs that we have as a result of our tourism-based economy. And we need to stop spending it on things that we don't need, like half-empty convention centers or over-bloated giant corporate advertising budgets.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there's another point that you had brought up about wanting to add universal wind coverage to insurance plans. And, you know, I had never thought about what universal wind coverage means. It occurs to me, though, whenever you have hurricanes coming through, there are going to be people that are directly hit by the hurricane itself. But you do have a lot of high force winds that come from maybe you're not in the direct path, or maybe you didn't technically get hit by the hurricane, but you do still suffer a lot of damage from that wind. By not having universal wind coverage, does that mean that there are some people that have damage to their property from wind, but that those claims are denied by the insurance companies?
Well, the claims are often denied by the insurance company for frivolous reasons. That's why many homeowners end up suing the insurance company in order to get their claim paid. But I also want to let folks know that the idea of a state-backed universal wind coverage program is not one that has not been tried. It is one that currently exists in the state of Texas, of all places, which is by no means a liberal state. And it also has an equivalent in California, which is a more blue state, but they use it for earthquakes, because really what they don't need in California is coverage for wind. They need coverage for earthquakes. And so they have a state-backed provider that allows for individuals, any individual who needs it and wants it, to pay a modest premium to that state program in order to have universal earthquake coverage. Texas does it for wind. And I think that this crisis has reached a point in Florida that this is something that we should consider for our state as well, in order to drive down costs and make sure that we're putting money back in the pockets of our homeowners.
I think that's a fantastic point. I think you're absolutely right. I also hear that there's a lot of flooding issues in Florida. Do the insurance companies that you have there cover flooding properly, or is flood insurance also a problem?
Flood insurance is definitely something that folks usually will try to get as part of their property insurance. Many folks are required to get flood insurance if they live in a federally designated flood zone. But unfortunately, what I've seen in my experience here in Central Florida is we had a lot of excessive flooding after some of the hurricanes that have come through in the last couple of years. Flooding that was so excessive that unfortunately it damaged the homes and the properties of many individuals who didn't live in flood zones and didn't have flood insurance at all. So overall, certainly there's a lot of reforms that need to be enacted to deal with the affordability crisis, because we know that the housing crisis itself, the soaring rents that are out of control, mostly driven by corporate landlords who are rent gouging families and are allowed to pretty much run wild as far as what they're allowed to charge for rents, and also the soaring property insurance rates that many landlords will then pass down to their renters as well, is something that has to be addressed first and foremost. But I also want to acknowledge that so much of the inflation is coming from things like basic needs, groceries, for example. And we have seen that many of these corporations and big national grocers are actually really padding their own profits. They are not charging consumers more for things like groceries because their costs are increasing. They're doing it to pad their pockets, to make sure that they're protecting their profits. And so, that is a big driver of inflation, as well as corporate greed.
Yeah, I think I had read the other day that 60 cents of every dollar in inflation that we've paid has actually just gone to corporate profits and weren't actually a result of inflation. I think you made another really interesting point, because I think that, when we talk about property insurance and when we talk about, this type of issue, it seems like there are a lot of people in Florida that may just say, well, I don't own a home. That's a homeowner issue. It's not really something I should be concerned about. But you make a really good point that if property owners who are renting those properties to renters, if their insurance rates double year over year, then that's going to have to come with a requisite increase in the cost of rent. So it seems like this property insurance problem affects renters just as much as it does homeowners.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that property insurance is going up for homeowners associations as well. I can speak from my own experience as a condo owner that lives in a condominium community, that we have seen a tremendous increase in property insurance coverage for our condominium community, which has resulted in much higher HOA fees. In this community where I live, many of the units are actually being rented out, and the renters are then having to absorb higher rents because the homeowner or the property owner is seeing that higher HOA and that higher property insurance as a result of this crisis. So we know that this is a big driver here. We know that corporate greed is also a big driver of it, especially with corporate landlords who are charging whatever rents they want because they're almost totally unregulated. And that's something that we need to tackle as well.
So do you think that there's something that could be done at a state level to try and stop the commodification of residential properties? Do you think that there's some legislation or some ideas that exist that could help, I guess, slow down the rate of companies buying houses to use as profit generation vehicles?
Absolutely. And I think that has everything to do with making sure that we put forward policy solutions that slow this trend of big corporations buying up houses in neighborhoods, then immediately renting those houses out and rent gouging families and charging the highest possible rent they can, because what that does is it not only makes those houses unavailable as housing units that Floridians and Florida families can actually buy for themselves and live in, but also it's perpetuating the housing crisis because it is allowing for them to drive up these rents totally unregulated. It's driving up the cost of the houses as well when they're being sold for these prices because they're being bought by the corporations who can afford these prices and then charging the higher rents. All of this is part of an economic ecosystem that is driving higher costs in housing, and the legislature needs to address and tackle this issue.
Absolutely. So I hear that one of the problems that we have with the housing crisis, the housing affordability crisis, is that we don't grant permits often enough for building new units and things like that. And one of the things that's happening is because there's so much demand for the few units that do exist and the inability to add more to the supply, that it just forever increases the value or the cost of the ones that already exist. Do you have any plans on changing the permitting process or allowing more housing units to be built?
Well, the permitting process is something that usually local governments have exclusive jurisdiction over. However, I think that there's a lot to be said about the need, especially in communities like Orlando and Central Florida, for us to build up rather than to build out. What we need is high density housing. We need more infill housing. We need to stop bad growth and promote smart growth. We have so much sprawl in Central Florida where homes are being built out further and further and further out from the urban core. That's further away from where the jobs are. It's further away from what the limited public transportation is that we currently have. And they're not affordable or attainable homes. What you see is a lot of developments, especially on the east side of Orange County, parts of the Senate district that I hope to represent, where they're building luxury homes east of the urban service line, where they don't have easy access to fire and police. They're not being able to get the typical government services that you would be used to closer to the urban core. And they're trying to build these homes on already failing roads with very limited infrastructure. And it's just contributing to more sprawl while not actually addressing the housing affordability crisis.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think a lot of things that people don't consider is as your footprint gets wider and wider, it takes more resources to get fire departments farther out. It takes more resources for police to be able to patrol larger areas. There's a lot of cost, a lot of hidden cost that comes with widening the footprint. And I think that mixed use housing and like you said, upward types of housing, I think that can do a lot to add housing to the supply while not necessarily creating a large cost footprint for building outwards. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this was really informative. I learned a whole lot about some of the issues that Floridians are facing, and I hope that we can have another interview soon and you'll be on the Digital Democracy Project.
Awesome, John. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate the time.